Okay, Congressman, we're live.
Emily, thank you very much, and welcome to the Cornell University community in the United States and around the world to a very special and quite timely briefing with Ambassador Bill Taylor, incoming visiting professor of law at Cornell University, Nick Rostow. We also had some Cornell students for about an hour conversation on the latest developments in Ukraine. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping details. On March 2nd at 4 p.m., we will be convening another Zoom, this one, Dispatch from Ukraine, Human Rights and Conflict in Eastern Regions, a conversation with Bernard-Henri Lévy, the French journalist and intellectual. His most recent book, The Will to See, is a highly recommended reading. He visited Donbass just before COVID and wrote a riveting and quite moving essay about what he saw. March 14th at 1 p.m. we'll be featuring an event with former CIA Director John Brennan. And on March 22nd at 7 p.m. a conversation with Huma Abedin about her book, Both End, A Life in Many Worlds. To register for those events, you can go to our website. We'll post a website address during this conversation. I also want to announce, we don't have a date for it yet, but we have two confirmed speakers. Within the next several weeks, we will be doing a congressional salon on Ukraine with the two bipartisan co-chairs of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio, and Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania. Again, you can register for those programs by going to our website, iopga.cornell.edu. The link will be provided in the chat. Also, please follow us on Twitter at IOPGA Cornell. We're joined tonight by some national leaders. On hand this evening, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Washington, former member of Congress, Denny Heck, former Congressman and Congresswoman Bill Enyart from Illinois, Chris Shays from Connecticut, Charlie Dent from Pennsylvania, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Florida, Martin Frost from Texas, John Barrow from Georgia, Jeff Davis from Kentucky, and the former president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, Fred Hochberg. We're honored by their presence as well. Now, we have a very large global audience tonight, so I want to get right to introductions. Ambassador Taylor and Professor Rostow and I will be conversing for about 30 minutes or so. At that point, about 30 minutes from now, we will give our audience an opportunity to pose questions. You can pose your questions live or in the chat room. Emily Anderson will give you instructions at that point. For now, I am so proud and honored to introduce Ambassador Taylor. We're thrilled to have him, especially on this night. Many of you watched him on CNN last night. I have a feeling we'll be watching him again later tonight, tomorrow, and over the next few days, because truly, what better expert on Ukraine is there than Ambassador Bill Taylor? He currently serves as the Vice President of Russia and Europe at the United States Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as chargé affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. He served in Baghdad as the first director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office from 2004 to 2005, in Kabul as coordinator of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan from 2002 to 2003. He is a graduate of West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. Kabul, Vietnam, Baghdad, Kyiv. You know, you could go to Boca also, Ambassador. It's pretty nice there for a little bit of relaxation. Joining me in questioning the ambassador is Nick Rostow. He will, as I mentioned, be a visiting professor of law, teaching international law at Cornell Law School during the spring 2022 semester. He has a very long list of public service positions, including serving as staff director of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, special assistant to Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush for National Security Affairs, legal advisor to the National Security Council under Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft, and special assistant to the legal advisor at the Department of State. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Let me just pose the first question, and then Professor Rostow, you and I will rotate. Ambassador, we obviously have a very fluid and rapidly changing crisis, which very well could turn again during this conversation. So let me pick up with President Biden's announcement just about 4 hours ago. 4 new sanctions, strong sanctions, an announcement that further sanctions may and will be implemented if President Putin escalates the crisis, but also left the door open to a continued pursuit of diplomacy to resolve this crisis. My question, Ambassador, is, has diplomacy run its course, and do you see any way to avert a worst-case scenario in Ukraine?
First of all, Congressman, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be here with Professor Rostow. As I told him a minute ago, everybody knows of him, but now we can say we've actually met him. So, Professor, it's great to be here. And Congressman Israel, the list of people that you mentioned, I'm humbled. This is going to be a great conversation. I hope and the most important part of this whole thing are the students. You know, this is a great opportunity for me to be able to talk to, and again, interact with students. I mean, we've already talked to a couple of them, got great experience in this part of the world. So it's already rich, Congressman. So first of all, thank you very much. Second, your question, good one. Diplomacy. Is there anything yet to be done? And the answer, of course, has to be yes. And President Biden made that clear. The only person in the world who can affect that is, of course, President Putin. President Putin has given no indication so far that he is off a course that is going to lead to the worst case that you just mentioned. That is a horrific conflict in Ukraine that will be horrible to contemplate. It will be horrible in its effect. It will be horrible on people, individuals, soldiers, families. It'll be terrible. So it is important that there is another route. There's another path. And that's the one you asked about, Congressman, and it is the diplomatic path. All of the work that the United States has done, and I will tell you, I'm very impressed with the Biden administration's work on this aspect. It's been an amazing effort to try to do two things. One, to deter President Putin from taking that awful step, but also to gather the alliance and the alliances and the number of nations and countries and groupings that people on this call will know well, that are focused on this issue. And again, there are two options for President Putin. One is to invade, which he seems to, he's already done. So as we know, he did in 2014, he invaded Ukraine in 2014. He's invaded last night. He's sent military forces into Ukraine, into Donbass. And the question is, does he go further? And the attempt from all this diplomatic work is to try to deter that, to try to indicate to President Putin and anybody else who makes decisions in Russia, but that's really talking about President Putin, that the cost of pulling that trigger, the cost of going over that precipice, whatever the metaphor is, the costs are terrible for him, for Russia. And those costs we're starting to see a little bit today, actually more than a little bit, serious sanctions. We saw a little bit of sanctions last night, but today President Biden laid out some serious sanctions. They're going to impose costs on Russia. Individual Russians, sad to say, Russian people will bear these costs. They'll bear the costs not because of Western sanctions, but because of the actions of their president. So that was on the one hand. But then your question is relevant. That is there another way? Yes, there's another way. President Putin can go for a negotiation. 4 negotiations, actually, although he's now given up 1. So maybe we're down to 3. The 3 negotiations that he could go to address some of his real concerns. And we're prepared to take his concerns seriously. the bilateral relationship and the bilateral negotiations between the United States and Russia on certain things having to do with strategic weapons, arms control negotiations, the placement of missiles. Those issues we can talk about. There's clearly we can talk about. There's another negotiation with NATO. Russia and NATO can have this conversation about conflicts between Russia and NATO, about avoiding interactions, incidents in the air, at sea, communications between the NATO forces and Russia forces. Those things can be discussed as well. Then there's even a broader issue, a broader conversation that President Putin can elect to pursue, and that's with Europe more broadly. There are 57 members of the OSCE that make up Europe in some sense, broad sense, and all those 57 entities, both nations and organizations, have a stake in the European security structure. Architecture is what a lot of people will call it. Professor Rostow knows about this architecture that has been put in place over the years. And President Putin doesn't like the current architecture, and he would like to make some changes to that. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that rather than going over the precipice. So that's the third one. I say that there had been a fourth conversation that could have addressed some of his issues, and that that negotiation was focused on the conflict that the Russians have precipitated in Donbass, a little part of the eastern part of Ukraine that has been at war. Russians have been at war with Ukraine in that part of the country since 2014 when they invaded the first time. And there have been negotiations among the so-called Normandy Four. These are the Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, and French, to try to resolve that particular issue, to no avail. And with the decision yesterday, President Putin made to recognize these two little puppet statelets that are part of Ukraine, that have been fighting Ukraine for the last 8 years. And President Putin yesterday recognized them. So that last discussion, conversation, negotiation is now dead. So it will go nowhere. So, but sorry, Congressman, it's a long answer to your first question. Short answer is yes, there is an alternative. And diplomatic could, let me just do one last thing in answer to this question, because I think it's a great one. President Putin can say that for 10 years, 12 years, he has been trying to he could say this to the Russian people. President Putin can say, I've been trying to get those Americans to take my concerns seriously, my security concerns. I didn't like the way the Cold War ended. I didn't like the architecture that came up after the Berlin Wall fell. I didn't like that. And I've been telling them I didn't like that. And they haven't paid any attention. President Putin can say, now they are paying attention. And they're willing, he can say, to sit down with me to address those issues. So he can say, I have actually won. I have succeeded in finally getting them to take my security concerns seriously, and I'm going to get ironclad guarantees written in treaty language, ratified by the United States Senate, and it'll be the law, and they won't be able to fly their bombers next to our border. So he could say, Congressman, that there's a win there. He's gone awfully far. It's going to be hard for him to turn this back. It's not yet dead.
On the question of long answers versus short answers, long answers are preferred, actually, Ambassador. The rationale for our institute.
Be careful, Congressman. Be careful.
We are anti-soundbite. We exist to deepen discourse and raise understanding. And these are complex and complicated issues that sometimes deserve complex and complicated answers. So it's all good. Professor Rostow.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be part of this conversation. Ambassador, it's wonderful to meet you, and Congressman, it's wonderful to see you again. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned and one thing you haven't mentioned, which I hope you will have time to address. And that has to do with the sentiment held by a lot of Americans that this is not our issue, that this is a European matter and the Europeans are rich enough and populous enough to take care of it. And what do we need to worry about Ukraine for? That's a separate question from the one I'd like you to focus on to begin with. And that has to do with the separation of the separatists and the whole movement toward separation. Is that something that Ukrainians living in Eastern Ukraine wanted to do or willing to do themselves, or was that something entirely engineered or mostly engineered by Vladimir Putin and the Russians?
Professor, it's much more the latter. It is much more, let me just put it this way. Without the Russians, it would not have happened. Let me just back up, because I don't mean to say that there were no divisions within Ukraine before 2013. Congressman Israel mentioned that I was in Ukraine from 2006, 2009. At that time, real politics. There were a lot of Ukrainians who thought that the Russia model and the Russia direction was what they should follow. There were a lot of Ukrainians who thought that the European direction and the European model was to be followed, should be followed. There were debates about NATO. And I will tell you actually on NATO, when I was there, 2006, 2009, there were probably 20% of, at most, Ukrainians who thought being a member of NATO was a good idea for Ukraine. You know, it was not, you know, there were probably 78% that thought it was a bad idea. But there were real debates. You know, there were issues having to do with language, Russian, Ukrainian, Hungarian in some parts of in the southwestern part. So a lot of debates. There were conversations about the European Union, about what kind of models, about the role of oligarchs and the role of the state. You know, land. You know, for a long time, up until actually this administration, this Zelensky administration, you know, you couldn't buy and sell land. That was an incredible debate back there, back in the time that I was there. In 2013, and this will get to the answer to your question about the separatists. In 2013, that changed, in particular in 2014 when the Russians actually invaded. And when I went back, Congressman mentioned I went back to do another round as the kind of acting ambassador, the chargé, in 2019. And I've been there a bunch of times since, but the contrast was so clear. Real politics, real debate, real divisions, let's be clear, in Ukraine before 2013, 2014. After 2014, and after that invasion, Ukraine was more unified than ever before. President Putin did more to unify Ukraine than any Ukrainian leader in history. And the separatists were led, trained, financed, equipped, encouraged by the Russians. They have, you know, the Russians, let's give them credit. They're very good. They've got capabilities, not just, now they have military capabilities. In 2008, their capabilities were not all that great and they had a hard time. They dominated, they were able to win in Georgia when they invaded Georgia, but that exposed a real problem on their military. That's been fixed. Their Russian military is very good. The Russian special forces are very good. The Russian takeover of Crimea in 2014, after the pro-Russian Ukrainian president Yanukovych fled to Russia, and that prompted President Putin to make a decision to annex Crimea, southern peninsula of Ukraine. They did that very well. They're very professional. They're very good. And their special services, their special forces, their special security services were very active in Donbass. And they had success in two cities, Luhansk and Donetsk. And those are the two capital cities of those two oblasts in the eastern part of Ukraine. And they had some success there because there were some Ukrainians. Let's be clear. Let's admit that there were some Ukrainians there who didn't like the outcome of what was going on in Kyiv, in the capital. And those people, those Ukrainians, were easy to mobilize by the Russians, and they did. The Russians tried to do more. It's back recording again. Oh, very good, very good. So again, in the spirit of long answers, short answers, the short answer is they are led by the Russians, and they would not have taken place. These separatist movements and these little governments would not have existed without the Russians. And I will be glad to talk about the why Ukraine question that you start off with, but maybe we want to come back to that, whatever you say.
Very good.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just a reminder, in about 10 minutes or so, we will open this up to Q&A from I'm happy to say, a very sizable audience around the world. Ambassador, I was watching some of the news shows after President Biden's announcement today. One in particular criticized him, saying that why wait to impose more severe sanctions? Why not just do them all now and force Putin backwards? It seems to me that to the point that you raised earlier, you can't just impose sanctions not only on your adversary, but on your allies. You need to bring them along. Is that why the president is suggesting that they could escalate? Is it just a matter of making sure that he has the collective support for these sanctions that he needs among our allies?
Congressman, I think the answer is yes, and it's related to how these sanctions are imposed and on which banks, for example. I mean, there are a lot of different sanctions on individuals, on sectors of the economy, but today the president identified two big banking institutions that he put full blocking sanctions on. Now, I had to check it out what full blocking sanctions actually means. But basically it means that those banks, those two big banks, one of them is the fifth largest bank in Russia, and the other one is the bank associated with the military. And that means they can't borrow, and they can't lend, and they can't use dollars. And so they're cut off from the international financial institutions. It's not, we've heard a lot about the so-called nuclear sanction, the SWIFT system. And the SWIFT system, of course, is the kind of the email system that allows banks to transfer money back and forth and keep track of these transfers among all the banks in the world. And that's a big deal, and that is not yet done. And so you're right to say that there's some in reserve. There are some measures that could be taken that are in reserve. But these measures that the president announced today on these banks, and there were some other ones as well, had the effect of demonstrating to Mr. Putin, the people around him, the customers of those banks, the people who actually use those banks, that we can do what we said. That the United States and its allies in Europe and its allies in the Far East, talking about Japan and Australia, can do this. It's not a hollow threat, and it has a serious effect. It's not the worst that we could do. There are a couple of things that we could do that we know how to do, and by doing these two banks today, we've shown we do how to do them. If I mentioned that one of those banks is the fifth largest, if we did the top three commercial banks, if we put that same blocking sanctions on the top three, that would affect about 90% of Russian citizens' bank accounts and financial transactions. And it would hammer, this is sad to say, these are Russian people. Probably some people on this call will have relatives there, and they will be hurt. There's no getting around it. They will be hurt. Why? Because President Putin is invading its neighbor. And that sadly is a price that Russian people are now starting to pay and will pay more. So one last point about the decision, because about the decision only to do this first set of sanctions and not go the full bore, as some have suggested, and that is he moved in. President Putin moved in, and let's be clear, he violated Ukraine's sovereignty. He went across an internationally recognized border. He controls, of course, now, but he went across this border into a part of Ukraine that, again, he controls. In response to Professor Rostow's question, these separatists control that. They're sympathetic to, led by, dependent upon the Russians. They're not going to shoot at these tanks and the Russian military coming into Donbass. They're going to be happy that they're coming in. Apparently, they organized some demonstrations in support of these tanks coming in. The point is, that's still a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. And President Biden was pretty clear a couple of weeks ago that any movement of tanks, infantry, aircraft, missiles across that border is an invasion. That's the definition of an invasion. And he said, if there is an invasion, according to that definition, any of those things coming across the border, he's going to put on sanctions. And so that's what he did. And that's what he did. Now, because it wasn't yet an actual military move being opposed by Ukrainian military forces, and thus there's no fighting, there's no conflict, other than kind of the low-level fighting that's been taking place for 8 years, during which 14,000 Ukrainians have been killed since 2014, when the Russians invaded the first time. 14,000 Ukrainians, military and civilians, have been killed out there due to this conflict. That will double, triple, quadruple if President Putin pulls the next trigger and sends those military forces from Donbass into the unoccupied part of Ukraine. Or he could come down from Belarus, go down towards Kyiv. Yeah. Or he could go to the south, go to Mariupol and Odessa, and link up with Crimea. A lot of scenarios, all of which, by the way, will be opposed fiercely. We talked just before we came on here about, will the Ukrainians fight? The answer is absolutely. The Ukrainian military will fight. It's a lot stronger than it was in 2014. Still no match for the Russians, but it will fight. The Ukrainian people will fight. They're organized into territorial defense forces. You see these grandmothers out there, learning how to fire weapons. The Ukrainians are serious about defending their land. They're serious about defending their land. They will fight, and that will happen as soon as President Putin pulls that next trigger to go into contested area. Because right now, Ukrainians are defending their land right on that border.
Let's do this, Professor. I'm going to ask you to ask the final question, but first, I'm going to ask Emily to give everybody instructions. We have quite a few questions lined up. We have 2 students who will be the first to ask. I'd like Emily to give our audience of nearly 1,000 people instructions on how to pose a question either live or in the chat room. Then we'll go to our 2 students, and then I see we have some questions from Congresswoman Ross-Lehtinen, Lieutenant Governor Heck, and quite a few others. So Emily, give us instructions, and then Professor Rostow will ask his final question.
Okay, so if you would like to pose a question, you can submit it through the chat room down at the bottom, or you can raise your hand to ask the question live. Again, you can pose a question down at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you.
Professor?
Well, thank you. I really would like to hear your answer to the question about Americans who think the Europeans have been free riders and therefore it's a European problem. I'd just like to add the comment that it is astonishing. I mean, I started life as a diplomatic historian, And Hitler did exactly what Putin is doing, only it was Czechoslovakia in 1938. Manufactured a separatist movement, a oppressed German minority. And I was surprised that President Obama didn't call him on it and use that analogy, and I'm surprised President Biden hasn't used it too. But I think it's very important that you address the question about why this is an American interest that's at stake.
Professor Rostow, it's very key. I'm so glad you raised the historical analogy, which is fraught, as everybody on this call understands. When you start talking about the events of the 30s and the late 30s, and it brings up the vision, exactly what you say, and there is a parallel. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. And the politicians on this call, the professional politicians on this call, I don't include myself in that, but Congressman, you know who I'm talking about here, will say, President Putin, this is the closest I get, Professor Rostow, to your point there. President Putin is in danger of being in a category of leader that we saw in the last century, who attacked unprovoked and neighbors and killed thousands, hundreds of thousands, some even millions. Those leaders, those dictators, they're in a historical category that President Putin is liable to join. He doesn't want to be there. We know we can fill in the blanks. We can go farther on that, but he, on the other hand, thinks he's going to join, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and he even thinks that Stalin is a hero, that he would like to join that category. We can debate about that, but he thinks this is his ticket to history, to being a grand historical Russian hero, and he is liable to be the opposite. So there's that. But now your question about why this matters to the United States, why it should matter more, you probably are implying to the Europeans. I've got kind of two answers kind of to the first one, and it gets to your second one about Europeans. The first, it's both. The first answer of why we care about what goes on in Ukraine, and it's beyond that there are 44 million Ukrainians, all of whom want to have a life just like we have. They want a normal life. They don't want more than that. They don't want any new land. They don't want special privileges. They just want a normal life. They would like to be able to live their life and, associate with whom they want, elect their own leaders, raise their kids, try to get a better economy to develop. This is what they're after. And we now think that sovereign nations get to do that. And so Ukraine is a sovereign nation in that regard, but it's beyond that. It is beyond that, because we hinted at this earlier. There are standards, there have been standards and norms and understanding principles, treaties that have guided interactions among nations in Europe since World War II. And these norms and standards and treaties and principles, like sovereignty that we just talked about, Ukraine wants it to be a sovereign country. All nations now, we think, are sovereign. There are not some nations that are big and strong who have more sovereignty than others. No. Our understanding today, our belief, the principle today is that big nations, small nations are sovereign, and big nations don't get to dominate small nations because they're more powerful. We know that old saying. That's not what we believe anymore. We don't believe in spheres of influence. This is again the previous century. There's a whole lot wrong with the first half of the previous century, and we don't want to go back there. And that's what Russia, Putin in particular, is trying to impose. And that challenge to those norms, those standards, those understandings that have kept the peace and made it possible to prosper without major land wars in Europe for 69 years, from 1945 until 2014, when the Russians invaded Ukraine. It was not a perfect time. It wasn't an idyllic time. There were problems, there were small wars, there were conflicts, there were real politics, but we didn't have a major land war. And that has been ripped up in 2014 when they invaded, and ripped up essentially yesterday, again, when President Putin recognized the independence of part of Ukraine, part of a sovereign country. That system is valuable to us. That system is valuable to Europeans. The Russians attack Ukraine, and this gets into my kind of more, I won't say emotional, but more, it's almost a moral argument and the Russians attack Ukraine in the first instance because Ukraine's on the front line. It's on the front line of Europe. It's on the front line of the West. It's on the front line of democracy versus autocracy. Ukraine's on the front line, and the Russians have declared war on Ukraine in 2014 and now again, unprovoked. There is no reason for Mr. Putin to attack Ukraine. There's no reason. He's looking for a reason. He's looking to try to manufacture a reason. He wants to provoke the Ukrainians into doing something that he can say, look, they're attacking us. And there'll be false, flags and all the stuff that we've heard about over the past 2 weeks. So President Putin's looking for a reason. He doesn't have one now. Ukraine's on the front line of that fight. And Europe is standing behind it. And the United States is standing even back farther. We are affected by this fight. We are affected. President Putin interfered with Ukrainian elections in 2014. I was an election observer in 2014. And the Russians tried to hack into the Central Election Commission computers while I was there in an attempt to try to change the outcome of that election where Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, fled to Russia. They had an election. President Poroshenko, Zelensky's predecessor, was elected, and the Russians tried to interfere in that. They almost succeeded, but didn't succeed at the last minute. The Central Election Commission was able to defend themselves. The Russians didn't stop there. As we know, as the congressman mentioned, the Russians interfered in our election in 2016. Studied, examined, investigated over and over. No question that the Russians tried to affect our election in 2016. We're affected by that. Another example of how the Ukrainians are on the front line. The Ukrainians, again, were the subject of, the Russians attacked Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure in the western part of Ukraine in 2015. They shut down the electrical grid. And that caused incredible both damage, but also concern, worry, panic even during that time. They were able to turn it back on, turn the grid back on. The Russians didn't stop there. The Russians shut down a pipeline in the eastern part of the United States. They have planted malware in government computers. The Russians have attacked us after they tried it out in Ukraine. Ukraine's on the front line. And the moral argument here is the United States, Americans, we support our military. We support the soldiers and the sailors and the Marines and the airmen who are fighting our wars. And these service members are on the front line for us. Ukraine's on the front line for us as well, and we should support it. The Europeans support it. Now, your point is a good one. Europeans should support it. And to be fair, while we can talk about burden sharing, and we can talk about the percent of GDP that we devote to defense, and we can talk about where the real military heft is, which is clearly in our military, there's no doubt about that. In this crisis, the allies are doing different things in the same direction, pulling in the same direction. For example, the Germans, who have taken a lot of grief, a lot of it deserved, about not supporting Ukraine enough. Exactly your question. And we have a brand new government in Germany, and Chancellor Scholz, big shoes to fill, inherited, he comes in right in the middle of this crisis, and he won't say the word Nord Stream 2. And Nord Stream 2, of course, is this pipeline, natural gas pipeline that the Russians have built under the Baltic Sea all the way to Germany to provide natural gas from Russia to Germany. This pipeline would further increase the vulnerability of Europe to Russian blackmail, to Russian influence, to Russian pressure. And the Germans have been saying for years, oh, it's actually just a business deal. It's not a business deal. It's clearly a political project. It's not necessary. There are plenty of pipelines going across Ukraine to carry that gas. But no, the Russians didn't want to do that because that gives the Ukrainians a little bit of leverage. They didn't want that. They want to avoid Ukraine, and they want to have the leverage over Europe. Germany, to its credit, just today said it's going to shut down that pipeline. It's not in operation yet, and it will never go into operation because the Germans had decided. Now, we probably could have done it too. The Congress has been very helpful, I will say, on sanctions. And during the Trump administration, the Congress, many Congress people are probably maybe on this call who had something to do with the sanctions bill. And they passed a sanctions bill on Russia. In the Senate, it was 98-2. And in the House, it was a similarly crazy lopsided vote. So President Trump had no choice but to sign. And those sanctions give the President Biden, the ability to shut down that pipeline as well. So the Germans recognized that and picked up the same thing. The French are doing their work. The Dutch are sending aircraft. The Spanish are sending ships. The Baltic nations are sending some of their own weapons that we've provided them that kill tanks to the Ukrainians. The allies are doing a great job supporting Ukraine, and the Ukrainians appreciate it. The Ukrainians know where the leadership is coming from, and they are very appreciative of President Biden and his team. And I would say, there are some professional politicians on this call, and I leave it to them to express their political views. But I will say that by and large, except for some people are far right and far left, there is strong support even for President Biden and for President Zelensky in his country, far right, far left, for the work that they're doing. So they're pulling in the same direction, Professor, and which I think is a good thing.
We have two Cornell undergrads who will be asking questions, and we're going to go to Olaf Wilner and Ella Yitzhaki. Olaf?
Hi, thank you so much for the great conversation so far.
Olaf, where are you from, may I ask?
I'm from London.
Very good.
I'm a sophomore studying computer science and government in the College of Arts and Sciences. So you've mentioned part of my question, but my question is to you, Ambassador, is Germany's foreign minister threatened to cancel the Nord Stream 2 project. And today we learned that they decided to halt it entirely because of Russia's actions. My question is, why would Russia be willing to jeopardize the pipeline after fighting for it so much in the past years? Thank you.
It's a great question. Why would they jeopardize this pipeline that has meant so much to them? Why? President Putin has put a lot of stock in this pipeline. I mean, he really does want the ability to send another pipeline full of gas from Russia to Germany. So, Olaf, you're asking exactly the right question. Why would he jeopardize that? What does he get from this invasion? Why would he, unprovoked, attack Ukraine when that is part of the cost he will pay? He won't get that pipeline. The Germans won't let it go into operation. President Putin has to face other costs. We've talked about the sanctions on some of these big banks, and we haven't we've hit the 5th largest bank. We haven't hit the top 3 largest commercial banks, which will have even more effect, same as the cancellation of the pipeline. A big cost that he will pay is, sad to say, Russian soldiers who will be killed in this fight. I mentioned to Professor Rostow that, or Congressman Israel, that Ukrainians will fight. Ukrainians will fight fiercely. They're going to be, they're outnumbered, they're outgunned, they're out aircraft, they're out-shipped, but they're going to fight. They're going to fight fiercely, and there are going to be, sadly, a lot of Russian soldiers who get killed. There'll be more Ukrainian soldiers and civilians who will be killed as well. When those Russian soldiers come back to their towns and villages and small cities, to families for burial, those families are going to ask the question, exactly your question, Olaf, why? What did President Putin get for this? Is he now a Russian hero, or is he a Russian villain? Why did he attack this brotherly nation? You know, most Russians have a pretty good attitude towards Ukraine and Ukrainians. They have a lot in common. They have a lot in common. And so a lot of Russians don't know the answer to that question that you rightly asked. And I can't answer it either, because there is no good reason. I will say that there is no good reason for him to give up that pipeline by invading or to pay these other costs. Thank you for that. That's a great question.
Olaf, thank you very much. Ella Yitzhaki.
Hi, my name is Ella. I am a sophomore also studying government in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm from San Francisco, California, and you sort of began to answer my question. I was curious about how partisanship and political polarization has sort of affected the sentiments towards Ukraine, and you made it clear that there has been, wide approval of sanctions against Russia. But I'm more curious about how this particular conflict, and really just the evolution of Russian and Ukrainian politics from an American perspective, has changed interventionist policies or isolationist tendencies for Americans as well as their politicians.
Ella, that's a great question. That's a great question. Let me elaborate a little bit on what you said and get to your question. And when I say elaborate, I want to just emphasize what you said. That is, there has been bipartisan support for Ukraine and bipartisan opposition to Russian aggression over the years, over the decades. So I coordinated the assistance that the Congress voted every year in the 90s when the Soviet Union disappeared. The Congress, many of whom are on this call, Ella, recognized the turning point for what that was. That was a big deal. And the Soviet Union became 15 independent nations, 3 of whom are now in NATO and in the EU, and the other 12 are, Ukraine's one of them. Russia is one of them. And the Congress, in an amazing show of wisdom and foresight, appropriated a lot of money and gave direction to the administration, actually administration after administration, to support those 12 independent countries, in particular Ukraine, but others as well. We're talking about Armenia. We're talking about Georgia. We're talking about Latvia, Estonia. So that assistance was supported broadly, and the opposition to Russian aggression was broad as well. And gets to your question about kind of, there is this polarization, which I don't have to deal with, other than what we all have to deal with. But again, other people on this call will know more detail about that than I. But in this country, as well as in Ukraine, which you asked about as well, this threat of a Russian invasion, of an unprovoked invasion, has brought together, in Ukraine, it has brought together opposition politicians and President Zelensky. So President Zelensky is this, he's been in office 2 years. Before that, he was not in politics. He'd never been in politics before. He was a comedian. He was a businessman. And now He is leading a nation that is threatened by its great big neighbor, and people are pulling together, and he is stepping up to unite that nation. And there's political opposition that doesn't want him to do well, except he's now their president, and the country is now at war. It's been at war for 8 years, and now it's even worse. So that's pulled them together. In this country as well, Ella, and again, the congressman and his colleagues can describe this much better than I. But again, other than some people on the far right and the far left, and that perfectly legitimate, that's fine. But the bulk of Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, administration after administration, Republicans and Democrats, one after the other, have strongly supported Ukraine and continue to do so. And that, I think, is healthy. That, I think, is a healthy sign for our country. It's also healthy, actually, for Ukraine. I mentioned before, President Putin has unified Ukraine in a way that no Ukrainian leader has ever done.
Thank you so much, Ella. Speaking of wisdom and bipartisanship, our next question, Ambassador, will come from former Congresswoman Eliana Ross-Lehtinen from the state of Florida, Republican from Florida.
Thank you so very much. And what a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Ambassador, Professor, Congressman. Wow, and the questions from the students, outstanding. Although there are bigger issues here that we've been debating, after every international incident, think tanks, entities, big thinkers, professors and ambassadors, they talk about how has this international incident impacted America's role in the world. And although this is still an ongoing international incident, we don't know what will happen. Do you fear that America's role will somehow be diminished, that we're not being forward enough, we're not being aggressive enough? Or do you think that people will see that, boy, America is no longer, sending the Marines and we're trying the role of democracy? How do you think that America will fare in post-Ukraine this dilemma? Too early to tell, but I'm interested in knowing the professor and the ambassadors and the congressman's thinking on this. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliana.
I'm going to mute myself. I don't know how to do it.
A great question. And I'm so glad you asked the professor and the congressman as well. So I'll give you my quick answer. I'll try to do quick answers. And it is this one. I bet President Putin thought, on the basis of all the kinds of problems that the United States has right now, that we all know so well, I bet President Putin looked at our withdrawal from Afghanistan, just as one, our politics, the divisions. I bet President Putin thought, this is the time for me to try to arrest the movement of Ukraine towards Europe. I've got to do it sometime. Every day that goes by, the Ukrainians are closer and closer to Europe, farther and farther from Russia. I need to stop that, he says. And now's the time when the United States seems to be weak. The United States seems to demonstrate they don't have the stomach to stand up. They're concerned about forever wars, and that must mean they want to stand up for what they believe in. So maybe President Putin probably thought, who knows what's in his head, maybe he thought this is the time to do that. I bet he's surprised, Congresswoman. I bet he is surprised that President Biden, supported by the vast majority of the Congress, both sides, supported by the vast majority of the Americans, both sides, is standing up to President Putin and all of the force that he's assembled and holding Ukraine hostage. And President Biden is hanging tough. And to his credit, President Zelensky is hanging tough. And I am certain that President Putin thought that this young politician, not even a politician, this young person, 43 years old, President Zelensky, hadn't had previous office. I'm sure President Putin thought that he would fold. That all he had to do was assemble 130, 40, 50, 90,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, and this young kid would cave, would crumble, would be intimidated. And And to President Putin's surprise, he's stuck with it too. He has not blinked. So President Biden and President Zelensky are staring down this KGB agent. Now, there's one other thing, and I would love to pass it to the professor and the congressman, and that is, I imagine President Xi, China, had the same analysis. The Americans are weak. They don't have the stomach. They're divided. Now's the time. And he's watching carefully the United States resistance, pushback on President Putin. I'm sure President Xi is watching carefully. I'm sure he's surprised as well. Professor, over to you.
Well, forgive me, Nick, but we
No,
have.
yeah, I was going to say, over to you, Congressman.
59 people with questions. I get to ask whenever I want. Let me ask, Ambassador, is it at all possible for you to stay with us? I promise no more than another 12 minutes.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Glad to.
We never do this, but this is complex and complicated. And thank you so much. So with that, let me go to Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck, and then we're going to go to other members of our audience. Governor, you with us?
I am, Congressman. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, sir.
Ambassador, first of all, let me say I don't expect you to recall this, but you and I have spent a lot of time together in the HPSI skiff and in public hearing. And I just want to say, I can't exaggerate how much I respect and admire you and your service, sir. So thank you so very, very much.
Governor, that's very kind, very kind.
No, it's the truth, sir. Okay, here's my question. I'm not ready to leave sanctions. You've laid out a really compelling case about the significant impact on the Russian economy that these sanctions and the ones yet to be employed will have. And I know you've said you don't know what's in his head, but I would like you to talk a little bit about how you think Putin sees this. Does he think we won't take this next step? Does he not care that the price he'll pay is worth it? As a modest student of Putin over a period of time, he's always got a next step in his head. How do you think he sees sanctions playing out, and how do you think it will impact his behavior going forward?
Governor, I think it's a great question. I wish I could say that President Putin has the ability and the inclination to weigh the costs and benefits and make a rational decision based on that calculation. If he did, and if, as I firmly believe, there's no doubt in my mind that these sanctions will inflict a heavy toll on the Russian economy. These personal sanctions will inflict a heavy toll on the people right around him. And President Biden has even said that he's considering putting a heavy toll on President Putin himself. I wish I could say, together with all the other things we talked about in terms of the Russian casualties he's going to experience, those casualties may lead to things that he can't imagine. That is disrupting, even destabilizing his regime, which is the thing that he counts most important. There may be people in the streets in cities across Russia in opposition, not just to the economic effects, but to the number of Russian soldiers coming back to be buried. So if I were he, and I were calculating the costs and benefits, I would be impressed with those costs. And as I say, I'm unimpressed with the benefits. I don't see benefits other than if I were President Putin and I wanted to be a great Russian hero, my ego, not good enough. Not good enough to kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and thousands of Russians. Not good enough. So I would say, Governor, that if he were logical, if he were rational, he would take the off-ramp. He would take the diplomatic route that Congressman Israel asked about right at the beginning. There is a way, there's another option to this invasion, and it's that negotiation that we talked about. That said, I'm not sure he calculates the same way I do. And you probably have studied him more than I have. I lived next to him for 3 and then 4 years. But I don't have a sense that I understand this man. And I'm worried, frankly, that he doesn't really care about the cost to his economy. He doesn't really care about the cost to Russian people. and the suffering and the damage that will do to their livelihoods, to their families. He doesn't care about that. He cares about himself. He cares himself about how he stays in power, and how he looks in history. I think that's what. So I wish I could have a different answer to that question, but and I would love to know yours, Governor. You want to give, Congressman? Do we have 2 minutes for the governor to give?
If he'd like. Denny?
I'd rather, thank you, Ambassador, but I'd rather give the time to other people who are in that very long line. But thank you, Ambassador. Again, thank you for all your service over many, many decades, sir.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend. Let's go to David Zaks, who has a question. David? David, are you with us?
He's muted.
Looks like you may be muted, David. So we're going to go on to another question. Ambassador, let me read from our chat room. We have quite a few questions. And it's interesting because one of my daughters asked me this very question just last night. Christine Neal asks, Putin has been building to this for years. Why now?
A great question. Great question, Christine. I've given a little bit of thought to this. I've hinted at this already. Every day that goes by, every week, every month, Ukraine gets farther and farther away from Russia. Putin's goal, Putin's obsession is Ukraine. He believes, he may be right about this, he believes that without Ukraine, Russia can't be great again. Russia can't be an empire. Russia can't be the massive power that he sees it being. Without Ukraine, Russia's a normal country. Russia might even be a democracy without Ukraine. But with Ukraine, he puts a great stake in that. And therefore, every day that goes by that more Ukrainians are born every day. And they almost all, 95% of the young people want to go to Europe. They don't want to go to Russia. So Putin sees that time is not on his side. That's number one. I think that's a really important point. Number two, we already talked about as well. He sees now it's kind of the time when the West is disunited, and there's a new German government. Angela Merkel is no longer there. Britain's having a hard time, and the French president's running for re-election. All these problems in Europe. Now may be the time, Putin may be thinking. Third, and we talked about this too, the Russian economy is dependent on oil and gas. The Russian economy depends on exporting oil and gas around the world. That's the source of its GDP. That's the source of its government revenues. And that, whatever the current price of oil is, which is pretty high, sad to say, that's not going to last. That's not going to last. That oil and gas is not a solid foundation to build your economy on. And it's less and less solid as the years go by. Time's not on his side in that regard. One other thing which is related to the progress of Ukrainians going away from him, every day that goes by, the Ukrainian military gets stronger and stronger. Every week, every month, that more supplies come in, more capabilities get sent to Ukraine. They used to be their military in 2014 was not good. It is now very good. It is now 8 years later. They've been fighting the Russians all this time, and they have a strong military. A lot having to do with outside support, with U.S. support and with NATO support, and that's only going to grow, and they're only going to get stronger. So if he wants to take advantage of all those factors, I think that's the answer. So, Congressman, that may be an answer to your daughter. I hope it's an answer to Christine.
David, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please? We're trying hard to get you on, David, but in the absence of that, let me read a question from Sergey Sidorenko. He is a Ukrainian-Canadian MPA grad student at Cornell, who very much appreciates the discussion tonight. He says that in his view, it seems that Europe and NATO stand in a unified front against Russia's invasion, but it's clear that it's not necessarily the case at closer examination. He argues that Germany is on the fence given Nord Stream 2. Macron seems to be trying to single-handedly resolve the crisis. Question is, how can the US bolster and revitalize the anti-Russian alliance it de facto leads?
Sergey, I'd be interested to know where you're from. It makes no difference at all to your question because it's a great question. But I'm always interested in where Ukrainian, where Ukrainians grew up and what their backgrounds are. So at some point, Sergey, we can have this conversation. But I will say that despite all the problems that you just described, the NATO alliance is stronger, more unified today than it has been in years. So I served in NATO. I was at the U.S. Mission to NATO in 1987 to 1992. Long time ago. I know a lot of people on this call were not even born when I was serving in NATO. However, I saw how NATO worked, and it's complicated, and it's divisive, and there's even more. I was there when there were 16 nations. Now there are 30. So it's even more. And amazingly enough, this crisis caused by the Russians has united NATO in ways that I've never seen. And despite the German concern about Nord Stream, they said it was canceled as of yesterday, and good for them. That was hard for them to do, but that's a demonstration. Macron, I take your point about separate channel to Putin, failed, and he's supportive of President Biden. President Biden's gone out of his way to consult with and take into account and encourage President Macron in his efforts. He saw President Macron, he saw Chancellor Scholz. President Biden, again, the other thing that's gone on in this vein, Sergey, is, and again, that I've never seen, is the flurry of diplomatic activity that we've seen over the past 3 months. And we're talking about phone calls from President Biden to all these people you just talked, and more. We're talking about Secretary Blinken making phone calls after phone call. I don't know. He must start in the morning and go. Oh, and it's not just NATO allies. It's not just Europeans. He's calling the Saudis. He's calling the Qataris. He's calling the Indians. He's calling the Pakistanis. It's of course the Japanese and the Australians. In this activity, this burst of activity since October and November, has, in my view, unprecedented. It's just amazing. And you get to your point, Sergey, I think it's been effective. I think you're seeing a united alliance, NATO, Europe, Far East, the Western democracies are amazingly united. And I think President Putin sees that, is worried by that, whether it will deter him. Same question that we talked about earlier.
Final question, and I ask this question because it is part of a stream of very similar inquiries. It's reflected by Fred Hochberg, former president of the Export-Import Bank, but also, again, asked repeatedly through this stream of questions, and that is, Ambassador, what risks should we look towards in the United States? Is there the possibility of Russian cyber attacks on us? What do you think Putin believes, or what options do you believe that he believes he has directly impacting us?
There are two categories of actions that will directly impact us. One category is what Putin can do, and this is a direct response to his question, and includes hacks, cyber attacks. Obviously, the disinformation that he is able to do, we're doing a little bit ourselves, by the way. It's not disinformation, but we are using information in an attempt to deter this war. We're releasing, people on this call have been on committees, congressional committees that oversee intelligence. And I'm sure the congressmen and women on this call who have seen that work up close know how hard it is to get that information, that intelligence declassified, to put it out there, and they've been able to do it. So there are ways to counter these threats. So the first category includes things that the Russians can do and that we can counter. Cyber attacks, we can counter. We know where cyber attacks come from, and we can figure it out, and we can go after them. This counterintelligence we've talked about, the counterinformation we've talked about. So there are those things that can they can bite us. You know, we've seen how cyber attacks on pipelines and food supply and this can affect. We're getting stronger, we're more resilient, but we can deal with it. The other set of issues of costs really that Americans are going to pay is going to be in terms of probably energy prices. It is very likely if Russia attacks, if Russia invades again, let's just be clear, they invaded in 2014. If they invade again, they invaded yesterday, if they invade further again, then there will be disruptions in the energy market. There's no doubt. It might be because there's some sabotage. It might be because the Russians withhold supplies. It might be because the supply chains are disrupted in a war, in a major war. We're talking about a major war in Europe. So that's one way that Americans may well feel the pain, feel the effects of this. Sanctions, let's just be clear, sanctions have a lot of effects, and they sanctions inflict pain on both sides. You know, sanctions are, in some sense, you know, a disruption of a trade, of a deal, and in a deal or a trade, both sides are better off. That's why they make the deal, whether they're selling steel or whether they're selling oil and gas, or what, both sides get something that they want. When you break that up, when you say that's not possible, when you prohibit those deals, that causes disruption. That causes prices to go up. That causes people not to have the products that they count on. Sanctions are not free. They will affect, there's very clear that they will affect the Russians more than they affect anybody else. And that's the goal, that's the purpose, is to try to make President Putin understand that it's not worth it. That's the goal of those sanctions. But we have to recognize, and President Biden, again, to his credit, has gone on TV, 3 times now, saying, this is going to be painful. This is going to hurt. You know, freedom is not free. There's a price to liberty, and we're ready to pay it because we do value these principles that we're talking about. And we do value our allies and Ukrainians, but it's not without cost. So it will. So that's the second category, and both will feel both. I believe, and President Biden apparently believes, it's worth it. And if we can establish those principles that will keep the peace, again, restore the peace, recommit to these agreements and treaties that kept the peace for a long time. If we can reestablish that, that will be worth it.
Before we sign off, before I properly thank the professor and the ambassador, let me remind our viewers, March 2nd, next week, 4 p.m., Dispatch from Ukraine, Human Rights and Conflict in the Eastern Regions, a conversation with Bernard-Henri Levy. March 14th, a conversation with former CIA Director John Brennan. And coming up, a congressional salon on Ukraine with the 2 bipartisan co-chairs of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur and Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. Nick Rostow, welcome to Cornell. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome you personally. And Ambassador, on what is arguably the busiest night of the busiest week of the busiest month of the busiest year of a very busy career, the fact that you would spend well over an hour with the Cornell community is a credit to you and very, very deeply appreciated by us. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the
thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Professor, it's great to see you. All the students, great questions, and it's been a real opportunity for me. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, everybody. God bless.